Adventures of Math Girl. With the help of Pocket Ronnie, you also can become a trusty sidekick of Math Girl, like Kid Calculus and the Daring Derivative. Okay, we're doing the distance and the midpoint formula. These have to do with the graph. So let's just say we have 2 points on our graph, and let's just call this point 1. So if this is point 1, it's going to have some x-coordinate and some y-coordinate. I'm putting the subscript of 1. That's my x-coordinate for point 1. That's my y-coordinate for point 1. So let's call this point 2. So it will be some x-coordinate, and then it will be some y-coordinate. Okay, again, I'm just putting the subscript 2 on there. This just means this is my x-coordinate for my second point. This is my y-coordinate for my second point. What we're going to be doing is we're going to find the distance between these 2 points. So if I drew a line from here to there, that would be the distance between those 2 points. The distance formula comes from Pythagorean theorem because I have a line here. I can draw a right triangle between these 2 points as well. And then this would be a leg, this would be a leg, and this is my hypotenuse. So remember, Pythagorean theorem is leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. And that's where the distance formula comes from. So when we're finding the distance between 2 points, really what we are doing is we're finding the distance of the hypotenuse of this triangle. Alright? So the distance formula is D equals, D represents the distance between the 2 points, the square root of the difference of my x-coordinates squared plus the difference of my y-coordinates squared. Okay, so when I take the difference of my x-coordinates, I am finding the distance of a leg. Okay, that's what I'm doing when I find the difference of my x-coordinates. If I went back to my triangle, the difference of my x-coordinates, if I go this distance x and then this distance x, and I subtract the 2, I'm going to find the length of that leg. Okay? Then when I find the difference of my y values, I am finding the length of this leg in the y direction. So, and then that square, this is like leg squared plus leg squared, would have equaled h squared, but to solve for h, you take the square root of both sides, and that's where the square root comes from. So the distance formula comes from Pythagorean theorem. So this is how you can find the distance between 2 points. Now the midpoint formula is you're going to take the average of your x-coordinates. So if I add 2 numbers, then to take the average I divide by 2. Then you take the average of your y-coordinates. So remember, I'm adding 2 things, so I divide by 2, take the average. So the midpoint formula, what this does is, once you take the average of your x-coordinates, that gives you one specific x-coordinate. When you take the average of your y-coordinates, that gives you a y-coordinate. So each one of these values gives you an x-coordinate and a y-coordinate, and this point will be the midpoint between your 2 coordinates. Okay, let's work some problems using the distance formula. So I'm looking at 22D, number 6 and 7. We're going to look at number 6 first. At the top of this page, they give you some points. Problem number 6 says find the distance between point A and point D. Point A is the coordinate -6, 6. So basically, I started at the origin, then went over -6 in the x direction, and then went up 6 in the y direction. And then point D is the origin, 0, 0. So they are asking us to find the distance between point A and D. So this line is what we're finding. So instead of going through the process of drawing a right triangle and calculating the legs and then determining the hypotenuse, we can just go straight to the distance formula. Okay, so the distance formula is D equals the square root of the difference of my x's, so x2 minus x1 squared, plus the difference of my y's squared. So we take the difference of our x's, square it, take the difference of our y's, square it, add those two numbers together, then take the square root. Alright, so we can we just need to label point 1 and point 2. It doesn't matter which point you label, just be consistent. So I'm going to call A point 2, okay? So this is going to be point 2, and my origin is going to be point 1. So I need to put in my x-coordinate for point 2. So my x-coordinate for point 2 is -6. And then my x-coordinate for point 1 is 0. Remember, the formula is a subtraction sign, so you need to keep up with when your coordinates are negative. So we square that because that's the difference of my x's squared plus, that's my formula. Now the difference of my y's. I need to start with y2, which is 0.2 y-coordinate. That would be the +6. Minus the y-coordinate of my 0.1, which is 0. Square that, then take the square root of the whole thing. Okay? So -6 minus 0 would still be -6. If I have -6 and subtract 0, it's important to keep your parentheses because a -6 parentheses squared will turn out to be a positive number. Then 6 minus 0 is 6. Remember, PEMDAS says do parentheses first. Okay? Now a -6 squared would be a positive 36. 6 squared is a positive 36. Still, I haven't done my square root yet, so we leave that. So 36 plus 36, 72. So my distance is square root of 72. Always look to see if you can simplify your radicals. Okay, so we're going to leave these in radical format. So we need to simplify square root of 72. It will simplify into square root of 36 times square root of 2. Square root of 36 is just 6, and then square root of 2. So your distance between those 2 points is 6 square root of 2. Yes, we can put them into decimal format, but for these lessons, we're going to leave everything into radical format. Alright, now we're going to be doing number 7, 22D number 7. They're asking us to find the distance between point E and point C. Point E is -5, -2 coordinate, and point C is 4, 3. So they're asking us to find the distance between those 2 points. So instead of drawing a right triangle and using Pythagorean theorem, we can just go straight to the distance formula. Okay, I'm going to call point E, I'm going to call that point number 2, and then point C will be point number 1. So we said -5, -2 will be point 2, and then 4, 3 will be point number 1. So we start with the distance formula. I recommend you write your formulas down first and then plug everything in. The distance formula is the difference of your x's squared plus the difference of your y's squared. Add those two together and then take the square root. So let's plug in what we know. We're going to call this point 2. So my x value from point 2 is -5. The formula is a minus. My x coordinate from point 1 is a 4. So we're going to square that plus my y value from point 2, -2, minus, because the formula is a minus, my y value from point 1 is 3. Square that, then we take the square root. Do parentheses first. I'm in debt 5, I'm in debt 4 more, so I'm in debt 9. I'm in debt 2, I'm in debt 3 more, so I'm in debt 5. Square that. Keep up with everything until you actually do it. -9 parentheses squared would be a positive 81 plus -5 parentheses squared would be a positive 25. So 81 plus 25, 106, square root of 106. So then we need to see if we can simplify the radical. Alright, square root of 106 does not simplify, so that will be your final answer. The distance between those 2 points is the square root of 106. Again, we're going to leave these in radical form. Alright, now we're going to be working on midpoint formula. We're looking at 22D, 10, and 11, and they've given you several points. We're going to look at these points. Number 10, want you to find the midpoint between E and B. Okay, the midpoint. Midpoint means halfway between. So there is a coordinate, a point along this line that is halfway between E and B, and that's what we're going to find. Alright? Again, it doesn't matter which one you label to be point 1 or point 2. So the midpoint formula is you take the average of your x values. So you're doing one x coordinate plus the other x coordinate divided by 2. That will give you an x coordinate. And you take the average of your y coordinates. And then that will give you a y coordinate. And those two values are your midpoint. Alright? So it doesn't matter which one I call 1 and 2. I basically need to add my x coordinates. So I'm going to take -5 plus, because my formula is plus. I am taking the average. So when you average, you add the two together and then divide by 2. -5 plus 0, because that's my other x coordinate, divide by 2. -5 plus 0 is just -5, and dividing by 2 is just -5 halves. Okay, so I'm just going to leave it as -5 halves. That is my x coordinate for the midpoint. Now let's find the y coordinate for your midpoint. Average your y's. So one of my y values is -2. The other y value is 5. Averaging those, you add those together and then divide by 2. -2 plus 5 would be a +3, and then divide by 2, leaves it as a fraction. So this coordinate is my midpoint. So if I went to graph this, so my x value, if I'm graphing it, I would leave them as improper fractions for your answer, but to graph it, so -5 halves is the same thing as -2 and a half. 3 halves is the same thing as 1 and a half. So I can go to my graph and plot this, and it should be on my line, and it will be the midpoint. So going over -2 and a half. 1, 2, over a half, and then up 1 and a half, 1 here. So plotting that point right there, plotting those coordinates, that is the midpoint between E and B. That is the coordinate for the midpoint. When you're finding the midpoint, you're actually finding an x and y coordinate. Right, let's look at number 11. It's asking us to find the midpoint between point D and point C. Point D is at the origin. Point C is the coordinate 4, 3. So we are trying to find a midpoint between the coordinates of the midpoint between those 2 points. So remember, the midpoint will be halfway in between. So just as a reminder, when you're finding the midpoint, you're basically finding the average of your coordinates. You're going to find the average of the x coordinate, and then you will find the average of your y coordinates. You're adding 2 numbers, so you're dividing by 2. Okay, so my coordinates are, I'm just going to rewrite them here. My coordinates were 0, 0, and then point C was 4, 3. So averaging my x coordinates, I have a 0 plus 4. I'm adding 2 numbers, so I'm dividing by 2. 0 plus 4 is 4 divided by 2, and 4 divided by 2 is 2. Remember, that is my x value. That's my x value for the coordinate of the midpoint. Averaging my y values. One y value is a 0. The other y value is a 3. I'm adding 2 numbers, so I'm dividing by 2. 0 plus 3 is 3. Divided by 2. We can leave that as 3 over 2. So my midpoint, the coordinate of my midpoint, should be 2, 3 halves. Or when I look down the graph, I can think of it as 2 and 1 and a half. So if I go back to my graph, and I go over 2, 1, 2, up 1 and a half, that was the coordinate for my midpoint. And yes, that point does look like it's halfway in between the points D and C.